Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be back with you and your colleagues. I'm also pleased that we have the participation of members of the K-Policy platform, and I look forward to our discussion. Uh, the let me start by saying that we've just had 4 tumultuous years of the Trump administration, during which U.S. policy challenged friend and foe alike. Uh, And I thought it would be useful to note in my discussion today what will change in terms of US policy and its implementation, and what will stay the same. Because even though there's a great difference between former President Trump and President Biden, in the area of trade policy, they have many of the same constituents, particularly in the labor unions. So the first order, I think, is to note that President Biden will likely retain much of Trump's trade policy legacy. The confrontation with China on trade and investment, including the trade war tariffs, is likely to continue. And high-tech export controls and screening of Chinese investments in the United States is likely to continue. Both of these have implications because of the knock-on effects of for Korean business that have interests in both the Chinese and the U.S. markets. U.S. import barriers on steel and aluminum introduced under Section 232 national security controls are likely, at least in the short run, to continue, because it's difficult politically to remove them without some other changes. Restrictive Buy American procurement policies are likely to be maintained, and they will become actually quite significant in impact because of the planned increases in infrastructure investment by the federal and state governments. U.S. is likely to stay on the sideline on the CPTPP in the short run, but I suspect, as I will note later in the talk, that there may be a change in this policy, U.S. policy, sooner rather than later because of action-forcing events in Asia. And finally, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, is likely to serve as a template for future U.S. trade pacts and future revisions of existing free trade agreements. While we've had several iterations of the Chorus FTA, it is not out of the question that there could be more, and I'll talk about that a little later as well. But the content and the implementation of U.S. trade policies will differ in key respects. And most importantly, I think America will resume its global leadership instead of an America First policy that has too often been viewed as my way or the highway. And I think this will require, and it will, and the Biden administration will seek extensive consultations with our key allies. This will be a big difference from the Trump era, when we acted first and then consulted, if at all, later. In addition, there will be a recommitment to the World Trade Organization and multilateralism, even though the prospects for groundbreaking advances in WTO reforms will be difficult, and I'll talk about that in a bit as well. Perhaps the most stark difference with the Trump era will be the emphasis on trade and climate, with the focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and supporting international initiatives to that end. It already started with the U.S. Readmission to the Paris Accord, and the United States has, and President Biden has put together a top-level team inside the White House to deal both with the international negotiations on climate matters led by former Secretary of State John Kerry, and also the domestic policy reforms that are necessary to look forward to a greener economy in the future. And so the Biden administration will have to walk very carefully on a very icy surface in trying to navigate moving forward with this trilateral agenda. The relations will be classified in three large buckets. I think there will be a focus on areas of cooperation with each other and with third countries. And here there will be a focus on working together to combat the pandemic, working together to deal with climate change. There will be another bucket where areas where commercial relations will be marked by sharp competition. And this more broadly will be the area of trade and investment. There will be sharp competition. There will be some controls for national security reasons. I'll get to that in a moment. But the idea will be not to decouple to the extent possible, but to compete and compete more aggressively. And that will involve subsidies. It will involve government support of other kinds for US industry going head to head with Chinese competitors. Of course, they will also be going head to head with Korean competitors. And so that's something that will involve important discussions between our two governments. Areas of fundamental differences will be addressed by the United States, unlike the more muted response of the Trump administration. And these fundamental differences are where policies will be adversarial with regard to human rights, for example. But there will need to be a recognition that these fundamental differences need to be carefully managed to avoid broader confrontation. Now, in the area of cooperation, the United States will seek to revitalize the strategic dialogue with China. Consultations are needed to prevent the escalation of bilateral disputes involving trade, investment, and visa restrictions, as I noted. Importantly, there needs to be care taken in the enforcement of US economic sanctions, which have become more targeted for particular Chinese policies, including developments in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. There needs to be care, particularly in the administration of the new Hong Kong Autonomy Act, that the United States does not impose new or takes care in it with regard to sanctions on major financial institutions that do business with both countries, and where sanctions could be very disruptive to regional trade and investment. The Chinese, in turn, have imposed their own blocking statutes, very similar to what the Europeans and the British have done in the past. And that puts companies, both US and Korean and other companies, in a very difficult position between a rock and a hard place. If they obey US sanctions, they violate Chinese blocking statutes and are vulnerable to retribution from Chinese authorities. If they follow Chinese law, they are liable to US sanctions and great penalties, possibly under US law. So there needs to be some better guidance on how to navigate this very narrow strait to enable businesses to better plan their trade and investment strategies. The consultations will also need to deal with commercial cybersecurity. And this is a problem that has been growing in leaps and bounds and was very notable in the recent past, not only with regard to China, but with regard to Russia and other countries. There needs to be an agreement between the United States and China and other important countries that we need to have constraints on commercial cybersecurity, for fear that if we don't constrain it, it will lead to more and more aggressive retaliation and then great damage to our economies and our international relations. Now, cooperation is needed where, as my friend Bob Zoellick calls it, the United States and China are responsible stakeholders in the global economy. And here it's mitigating global warming, it's responding to current and future pandemics, and it's deterring the proliferation of nuclear weapons in Iran and North Korea. Policy, I think, bringing together the large economies of the Asia-Pacific basin, I think we could find a solution because Korea and Japan and the United States and China all share, all recognize the need to do more, and I think we can do more. Where the greatest difficulty will be in the WTO reforms is in updating the subsidy rules, including support for how do you discipline support for state-owned enterprises. That's critical for having a level playing field in an arena that includes China, and there will need to be new ideas and new ways of thinking about developing new subsidy rules, perhaps starting on a sector-specific basis, or even involving subsectors to address subsidies that go directly to steel firms or civil aviation, for example. Now, commercial competition will become more intense and spur partial decoupling of the US and China economies. That is going to happen, and the challenge will be to limit the damage because the more the two major economies decouple, the more there's collateral damage for their trading partners. The US is likely to uphold the phase one deal. That's unfortunate because we want to see an unraveling of the tariffs. That's going to take some time. More importantly is what the United States does on export controls. I think under existing US law, those controls on high-tech trade and the screening of inward direct and portfolio investment will be recalibrated. And I think there will be a greater focus on critical technologies. So the idea would be you impose export controls on a narrower range of activities or technologies, but in those that are deemed critical, you put a high fence of protection around it. Instead of the policy that we currently have now, somewhat ambiguous, that projects export controls on a wide range of high technology activities. The Biden administration is starting a 100-day review to analyze supply chains in particular sectors, including semiconductors, electric vehicle batteries, critical minerals, and medical supplies. Just by those four areas, you can see that they are trying to focus more narrowly the scope of US export, high-tech export controls and technology controls to limit the disruptions to normal commercial activity. Again, there's a growing risk that US financial sanctions will cause a disruption, as I mentioned before. And that's something that is only going to intensify because the third bucket, though, is the one that's the most intractable. And Presidents Biden and Xi will sharply disagree on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. President Biden, I'm sure, though I haven't been party to the 2-hour conversation he had with Xi Jinping a few days ago, will object to Chinese policies against the Uyghur minority, against the pro-democracy supporters in Hong Kong, and the Chinese military threats against Taiwan. And he will be under pressure to respond with countermeasures, including economic sanctions. And there are a number of bills that have been put forward in the Congress that would require the executive to act and impose sanctions against people and entities that do business with those responsible for those policies in China. China regards these policies as internal affairs, and the U.S. opposition as an intrusion on Chinese sovereignty. And so, unless managed carefully, as I mentioned before, this could get to be a very fractious area of bilateral relations. And it's important to manage these intractable differences and avoid a broader decoupling of the two economies. Now, in my last few minutes, let me just try to say something that may be a little more uplifting, because so far it's not been the cheeriest discussion for early in the morning in Seoul. I think tensions with China may lead President Biden to renegotiate U.S. participation in an Asian-Pacific trade pact. The original TPP was never politically popular, so Biden was reluctant to rejoin the existing pact, and he remains so. But why should the U.S. reconsider? I think there will be action-forcing events, but there's already a good case for the U.S. to revisit participation in an Asia-Pacific pact. The CPTPP that replaced the TPP already removed provisions that were objectionable to Democrats in Congress and led President Obama to avoid presenting the agreement for ratification in the Congress back in 2016. But subsequently, the U.S. adopted many of the TPP provisions in the revisions of the NAFTA called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. So we have already adopted many of the rules that are in the CPTPP. And of course, the CPTPP and the TPP before it was based on U.S. law and practice and drew heavily from the Chorus FTA, which means that Korea is in the same position, that it isn't a heavy lift to undertake the rulemaking in the CPTPP because of the comparability of those rules with those that Korea has already adopted in the Chorus FTA. But there's other reasons why the U.S. needs to reconsider. Deepening, and part of it is what China has been doing in advancing its leadership in the region, deepening ties through the RCEP and through ongoing negotiations for a China-Japan-Korea free trade agreement, and upgrading its existing free trade agreements with other countries. This will set regional rules and discriminate against U.S. trade and investment interests. And it's one of the reasons why we went into the TPP in the first place. But it is now even more important given the advances that China has made in the last couple of years. Chinese pressure against Taiwan is also increasing demands in Congress to deepen support for Taiwan via a new trade agreement. Negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement with Taiwan, which some members of Congress are calling for, could cause a massive rupture in U.S.-China relations that I think would be damaging to everyone in the Asia-Pacific region. But perhaps Taiwan joining the CPTPP in partnership with the United States and hopefully Korea as well would provide a compromise solution, much like the solutions that were made to get that allowed Taiwan to join the WTO 20 years ago. There are a number of countries that are interested in joining the CPTPP. The United States should be there to make sure that the rules are set and set appropriately and to maintain high standards. And doing so would broaden support for trading rules in the CPTPP as revised and augmented that could provide precedents for broader multilateral reform in the WTO. In conclusion, I think that like the USMCA, US officials are likely to join or rejoin an Asia-Pacific pact only if the deal is renegotiated. But I don't think the deal requires expansive renegotiation. And indeed, one only has to look at the USMCA for possible areas where the US may seek to update the deal. The most difficult would be in extensive labor obligations and enforcement procedures, which will require some work to convince developing countries like Vietnam and Malaysia to go along and improve their pace of labor market reforms. But in other areas, I think the changes will be more incremental. Broader coverage of multilateral environmental agreements and fishery subsidies, marine conservation, wildlife trafficking rules. Those are areas where the TPP chapter was already quite good. USMCA goes a little better. Same thing on digital trade and the currency chapter in the USMCA, which mostly involves transparency obligations. I think the newest innovation, and one that would be very high on the Biden administration's priority list for rejoining or renegotiating the TPP, would be to add a new chapter on trade-related climate policies. And as I noted before, I think that's pushing on an open door with our trading partners in the Asia-Pacific region. So that and adding the commitments to better access to medicines, therapeutics, and medical equipment, which I think is already beginning to happen as a result of our pandemic response, would open the door to new negotiations and allow the United States to come back to the club. The final word is on what, and an optimistic note, is the US will re-engage and lead efforts on WTO reform. But unfortunately, I had to put this at the end of the talk because it is not the highest priority for the Biden administration, because of skepticism that the WTO process itself will allow effective and efficient negotiation of needed trade reforms and rulemaking reforms at the multilateral level. The WTO needs quick wins, and I think the best prospects are new pacts targeting access to medicines and vaccines and an improved augmented environmental goods agreement. That and a new agenda on trade and environment, I think will be a great priority and one where the United States will put a lot of effort. And that would be an important area where the WTO can make important new contributions to the global economy. That's about the most optimistic thing I can say, that climate is going to be back on the agenda. The Biden administration is going to put enormous resources in that area and support for international organizations that can contribute in one way or another to the mitigation of this very dramatic crisis we face in global warming. The WTO is poised to do that, and I think that's good news for US participation and contribution and leadership in that organization. So I've spent a little more than my allotted time, but I hope I put some issues on the table that can spur our discussion, and I look forward to it with you in the coming time we have available. Thank you very much.